too many things. There we go. Sorry. Okay, let's start again. So lovely to see you all. So this week, this month, hi Geraldine.
Right.
We are looking at this essay, An Entrance to the Woods by Wendell, is it Wendell Berry? Someone help me. I haven't got it in front of me.
Yes, Wendell
Yeah,
Berry.
Wendell Berry.
Um, and well, I just fell upon this, Harriet, in our big book, and I was looking
Yeah,
at it. Yeah.
yeah. I've been
Wait,
really
actually,
working my way through the
if
thing.
any of you
Yeah.
want to know where a lot of these essays come from, Harriet, would you hold it up again? It's the Art of the Personal Essay by Philip Lopate, which is it's a really interesting collection. Some of them are really quite long, and I do tend to kind of go for the shorter ones just because I don't want to ask you guys to read quite so much. But and would you say a little bit male selected, Harriet? There seems like quite a lot of them are by
A
men.
bit. I
Hmm.
mean, you've got some Virginia Woolf and, one, two other obvious ones.
Yeah, I mean, it feels a
Ginsberg,
little bit dated.
but not, it is fairly male oriented. But then that might be partly to do with the fact that, of course, it goes right back
Yes.
several centuries, and obviously in the earlier stages it was more male dominated.
Yeah,
Virginia
so it kind
and
of looks at the personal essay from an historic point of
yeah.
view, but there are some really interesting ones in here. And I think the reason this struck me was, well, for lots of reasons. Partly because I'm about to go away to my sort of week away in the wilderness, and it just made me feel like, oh God, I need it so much. Also because he's talking about something that felt so relevant now, but I also felt like, my God, we've just sort of progressed and gone so much further away from that almost that we're so much more entrenched in that sort of busy industrial influenced world that it sort of makes you think, have we so much, because he's sort of touching on us really losing sight of our, losing touch with our senses, isn't he? And this was written in the 70s, which, it was a newer thing then. So perhaps people were writing about it more readily. But I just felt like, my God, so many of us don't even know what that feeling of being completely cut off and coming back into nature in that very sort of profound way. Um, And also, I really liked its mixture of reflection and action, like the interiority with then sort of, him going on his walks, the very sort of simple task of him being in nature. But actually, it was quite a nice momentum, quite a nice forward momentum, which I thought would be nice to talk about.
Oops,
It's,
Oh dear.
from
gone
an,
again.
oh, oh, have I gone again? Oh gosh. Ah, sorry, I wonder if it's my,
Oops.
can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yeah,
come
you're
back
back
again.
again now.
Sorry, I
Again
don't know
now.
what's wrong with my Wi-Fi. It might be that my children are both at home. But although I've got it coming through my phone, so hopefully it'll be okay. Um, so yeah, anyway, I just want to put it out to you guys that yeah, from a technical point of view, it was also a really, to me, it was a nice balance between the reflection and the sort of the universality of what nature means to him, combined with this very simple kind of walking through nature and camping and it it picked up, in those bits where he kind of really immerses himself, it then picks himself out of that and it feels like it keeps our interest, because then he switches the tone, which I thought was rather lovely. But yeah, let me put it out to you guys and see what you thought of it, if anyone had any particular pressing thing you wanted to say about it. Harriet, do you want to go first? Because you weren't
Okay.
keen on.
Oh, well, yeah. So the first thing about it was that, just as you said, I was really impressed the way it moved around at the different levels. So you've got the very detailed but simple descriptions of the surrounding countryside. Very, very simple, but it gives you a whole feeling of the atmosphere. And you've also got simple descriptions of his activities. I mean, right down to towards the end, he talks about, I prepare supper and eat, and then wash kettle and cup and spoon and put them away. I
Mm.
mean, these are the sorts of things usually you're told, well, you don't really need to write that kind of thing, and it's boring. So that, and then then there's the level of the impression the wilderness has on him personally. And then there's the level of the wilderness and the technological world at a more in a grander way. And in both of those things, you're moving from the relationship with the specific to the relationship on a grand scale, like him talking about the universality and the stars and all that kind of thing, and then also talking about, but he was a real, or is, though I think he's very ancient now, I think he's still around, an eco-activist and a eco-political, the small p guy all his life. So this whole thing about technology and wilderness was one of his big things. So I guess this is one of the earlier examples. So I really appreciated that. And I appreciated the descriptions and I appreciated some of the ideas. So I was trying to decide why it was that it didn't grab me really. I didn't think, oh, I want to read some more of him. I'm interested in what he's saying. And I wondered, well, it wasn't on the level of the individual descriptions, because if you want that, he did that really beautifully in terms of the countryside. I think it was something about his individual relationship, while interesting, I didn't relate to it as well as I sometimes do. Um, I felt in some senses, some of it came over as a bit forced, I guess. I'm trying to work out why it was that while I appreciate the technique of it, some of the ideas were really interesting. It simply didn't grab me very much. I wasn't inspired to think, oh, I want to read some more of his, but I'm still not quite sure why that is. Maybe the other thing is that the pace is similar. I don't mean the pace of his descriptions, because that slows and widens and narrows. It's something about the pace of the actual writing, I think, feels a little monotonous somehow. I don't know whether I haven't really analysed enough whether that's because there's not enough variability in how he's using language. That might have something to do with it. Because it's not that the ideas aren't interesting. I just didn't feel that they came out and grabbed me. And
Did it
sometimes I had to think a bit hard about what he was saying.
did it feel a bit like he had a ulterior motive, like he was trying to
Yes, there's an
Yes.
element of that. And I
present
think
an
it
idea?
is a
Yeah.
political with a small p,
Mm,
which is him. I mean, he is, as I understand it, I don't know much about him, but I went and looked him up after
mm,
reading this because I was interested.
mm.
And essentially, he's an eco-activist,
So he's using
political
his
all
writing.
his life. That's
Yeah,
his big thing. Yeah.
he's using his writing to drill home something. Yeah, Julie.
I agree about the pace, but I thought that that was kind of commensurate with of his activity and his, his actual pace, physical pace. Um, Maybe I get what you mean about his voice.
Oh, Julie, you've just.
Oh,
Oh, sorry. Yeah,
yeah.
you were muted with.
Um, don't worry. I agree about the pace, but I thought that pace was actually matched his physical pace, which I thought was kind of true to where he was and this kind
Mm.
of steady. And it's kind of very grounding if you're going to go big with your ideas and stay very small with your actual footprint, geographically. Um, Maybe the voice thing, because I did pick up on that, and I've written, there's a kind of dated aspect to that because there's the use of one will come upon. There's the kind of we and talking about human history and mankind, and there is a kind of and he doesn't take the opportunity that somebody made now, where he talks about leaving his life behind, of saying what that is exactly, do you know? So we get a sense of him as being more of a kind of a man, at large in nature, very much like a Robert Macfarlane type. But I think even Robert Macfarlane mentions more personal details than this guy actually does. But I think that's his objective, is to talk about, and I did connect with him about his feeling of melancholy. I'm away for a week on my own in the very southeast tip of Spain, which is a kind of desert, dry area. And I don't have anything to look at. There's a couple of villas, but nothing else behind me. And I totally get that. I totally got what he was saying, weirdly. It really spoke to me right now. So I think it's very true. But yes, I was just picking up on that point about the pace and the voice. Um, but I think that he was trying to convey an aspect of the everyman, the kind of nature-loving guy, and trying to um, use that as his kind of vehicle for sort of bigger things. And it felt very genuine, him coming across those initials in the rocks, in terms of what he used to then change tack and things.
Mm.
So I was impressed by how how real it felt in terms of the train of his thoughts and where he went with them and how he then reset. So it's very well structured. It's a perfect example of anyone trying to write bit ideas about something else into a piece of actual physical, nature experience, or whatever you'd like to call
And
Yeah, I
he,
do agree with that.
sorry, Harriet.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I just going to say, yeah, I do.
Oh, your mute's gone on again, Harriet.
And say, yes, I absolutely agree with that it's masterful in that sense. And I'm kind of looking back at it, and there's certain descriptions of his personal feelings are really good, but they are very much in the then, here and now. And I think that's okay. I don't mind too much that I don't know much about his personal life outside that, because there's a bit sort of towards the end when he talks about the necessities of foot travel in steep country. For a time, I am reduced to my irreducible self. I feel the lightness of body that a man must feel who has lost 50 pounds of fat. As I leave the bare expense of rock and go in trees again, I'm aware that I'm moving the landscape as one of its details. That's lovely. It's about the here and now, the out of body experience. So maybe it just repays really careful reading.
Yeah,
Mm.
possibly. And also, I think Julie's point about it being very much of its time, I think, is really key as well, because not that many people were writing personal narrative then, were they? So it was sort of more unusual to, it wasn't memoir wasn't a thing, and it was all. I think it was before even the Joan Didions and the new journalism and all of that. So um, there's probably a reticence of putting yourself in it too much. Sue, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I I really struggled with it. Um, I read the Wilderness Essays by John Muir a while ago, and they're fantastic. And I read this and thought, why, like Harriet said, why is this not resonating in the same way? So I went back, almost like I was editing it, and there were some things that really struck me. So the start part, the beginning, it felt a bit self-conscious. And it's that some of my irritation stemmed from, I think.
Can you give an example?
Yeah, so my notes here say there's a certain amount of posturing in the way that he's presenting his authority and his expertise. And it says he's not used the Latin terms for the trees and the birds. Whoops. The latter he can identify both by sight and sound, but I wouldn't be surprised if he did know all the Latin words for it. And it made me want to argue with him and to pick up on inconsistencies and then to give it him back and kind of go, right, now have another go. Because there's odd bits that I just think you're being simplistic. You're not actually saying what you really mean. So there's one part where he talks about how it's haunted, but he digs into it in some ways, but he never, Garfield, that's really not helpful. But he never actually says, what is it specifically? So he talks about the dark under the trees and so on, but then later on, he's suddenly happy. And all he's done is slept there one night. And I kind of think, it felt performative rather than actually real. For me, there was a disconnect between the start and the end. He's trying to make a case for this place being haunted, and that idea isn't really carried through. There's other ideas that are really, really well worked out, but there's some bits where I've gone through it and my red pen has gone, really, really, really. And I just kind of think it should have gone back again for another, like, there's some bits that just need a bit more work for it to actually properly do its thing. The only flora and fauna he comes across that he can't name are the fish. And I just kind of thought, oh, okay. So you have got some limits then. But yeah, it's that whole kind of he's on one level he's saying, oh, I'm part of this landscape, and on the other sub part of it, he seems like he's standing back from it and just labeling bits that he can see. It's kind of like, well, yes, he appreciates some of it, but it's like it's too much like he's being a walking encyclopedia. And I think it's that juxtaposition of those two things really started to grate on me.
So it's more kind of engaging with the intellect and what he should be writing
Yeah,
rather than actually
too much head, not
feeling.
enough heart.
Yeah, exactly. Rather than feeling his way into it. It reminds me of
Yeah.
that Ray Bradbury quote that I put on my personal Substack, which was about, I think he puts a sign above his desk saying, leave your thinking, don't, or I can't remember what it is now. It's like, don't think when you're when you're writing. It's something along the lines, but it's like, leave your thinking brain outside, right through your feelings. Julie.
The haunting thing, I thought he was talking about, he used the word human history quite a lot. He did talk about all the other people that have been there over the centuries, and also even the night before, how he thought he heard human voices that was actually the river. So that was my interpretation of what he used the word haunting, and it went with the kind of dark motif in the beginning of the shadow, and the first night to the second day and the reaching for the sun. So there was that kind of light and dark about the whole piece, I think. Um, on the thing of being an authority, there is this thing about credibility, and I've done that myself, where I have named things in order to give that kind of grounding detail. I wouldn't say that I'm a nature girl, type, but I think it's really important to know what you're looking at. I have a plant identifier on my phone. That's how I can do it. And then of course I'm kind of growing my own knowledge, but I thought that also his stance. It's so funny because I actually thought he really did well to set himself up of who he was. Like if you didn't know anything about him, like what kind of outdoor guy is he? And I thought that the level that he came in at was actually very kind of, he wasn't, I didn't find him too authoritative. I thought there was a nice level of detail, and even just noticing where things grow and what grows underneath, the layering that kind of went with he is a poet. So I think there's a lot of metaphor in there, the layering of the landscape, the layering of human history. So yeah, but credibility. I thought he was very credible. And the other point I was going to make was about companionability. Like, would you spend time with this person? I think trying to write these kind of things where you're alone, and all that you've got to go on is got to be this kind of voice carrying this, and your personality or whatever your take on that landscape, and then other things that you bring into it is this idea of, because anyone who's writing travel writing or whatever is, would I spend the day chatting to him in those words? Absolutely, I would. I thought he was companionable enough even 40 years ago. So I'm just introducing those points as someone who's tried to write this kind of thing myself, and all the things that I thought of, that I thought that he did, and that I was aware of. I liked some of his wording, and and the run on of the and the and the and. So I think that there's a lot going on there that if I read it 5 times, I would find different things each time. It's actually quite dense in a way. It doesn't feel that way, but there's a lot in there
There's a
that he's
lot in
put
there.
in.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I mean, just I'll come to you in a minute, Harriet. Just on that point of the sort of emotional engagement, I think this melancholic and lonesomeness and the humility of the human being and the kind of if you allow yourself that you allow yourself to blend with nature, and so you're not actually that important. I think that is such a universal truth that so many of us don't acknowledge, and so many of us are fearful of. I mean, I'm saying us as in not me necessarily, but just as particularly where we're going in our political climate now, that felt really resonant to me, and also just this sense of how rare it is for us now to have any chance of not having any connection, and actually it really made me want to have that. So sort of from the perspective of reading something that was written 50 years ago, um, and the resonance that it has now, or how it makes me feel about where we are now, I felt that it was doing a job for me. It was actually revealing something that I could then learn from, which I think means that it's succeeding, that it still feels relevant today. So yeah, lots of really interesting points in this. Harriet.
Yeah, as people are talking, it made me realize that I didn't. I liked the details somebody else said and found it credible, and that was part of it. But what I'm beginning to think now is the thing that I perhaps didn't find credible, or maybe I wasn't. I'm not. I haven't read it carefully enough to follow the argument, were the bits where he tried to move it out into the universal political for small p ecological type points. I think I feel that somehow it might have been more successful to remain as a piece of writing about nature and about the individual's, predominantly the individual's relationship with it. That doesn't mean to say that you're not going to invoke that individual's position within the wider universe or the world or whatever, but it's about making points higher up. So, for example, I'm really slightly confused how he spent quite a long time talking about the history of mankind. And I like the haunted bit because it was the kind that resonated with me, because I can understand being somewhere and thinking about the people that have lived there and done things there and worked there and all that. And to me, that's part of the feeling of the relationship with a landscape or wilderness. It isn't just about nature, it's also about where people have walked. But then later on, he goes on to invoke this picture of sitting in the universe, and there's this sitting in the wilderness, and there's this cone that goes out to wilderness. And he talks about this wild place where I have camped lies within an enormous cone, widening from the center of the earth out across the universe. Nearly all of it a mysterious wilderness in which the power and the knowledge of men count for nothing. So then I'm thinking, hang on a minute, you've just been talking about men and men's history and the impact on that, on you and the wilderness. And now you're saying, in the broader sense, they count for nothing. And then he has this slightly weird metaphor consistently about flying, actually, which I'm not sure I link in with. And he talks about it being an engine, and then if it falls, and then which I just don't understand at all. So I'm beginning to think that the real problem for me is the next step up of the wider political points being made in a often metaphorical, rather obtuse way. He is a poet, somebody said, that doesn't really work for me when you're trying to make a broader political point. it works really well when it's about you and your relationship and your feelings, but less well at that level. Maybe it's something to do with that.
Thank you, Harriet. Geraldine, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I've been listening and trying to sort of untangle my reaction and my thoughts. I must admit, my heart sank when I saw it was a piece by Wendell Berry, because my previous experience of not being good, I have not enjoyed his writing. So I set off a bit grumpily into the essay, but then he then said something that really resonated with me, and it goes back to what you were saying at the beginning, Lily, about the pace of life these days, and technology, and our disconnect with nature, and our disconnect with ourselves, because we don't have time to just be and find ourselves. And where it changed for me was that he talks about I'm here in body, but my mind and my nerves are not all together here. We seem to grant to our high-speed roads and our airlines the rather thoughtless assumption that people can change places as rapidly as their bodies can be transported. And that really resonated with me, because I changed from a job where I had a 40-minute drive home to one where I had a 6-minute drive home, which I thought was great. But it was a very high-pressure job, and I realised after a few months that actually it was hopeless, because by the time I got home, I was still at work. And I carried on being at work because I hadn't had that transitional time. And I thought, oh, he's got something to say here that's really, really drawing me in. He's really hit a nerve there. I can relate to this, and I enjoyed the next few paragraphs, because it was very much about allowing yourself the time and the silence and the solitude to find yourself again, and to find yourself in a different place mentally and emotionally. And I thought that was really good. And then as Harriet said, he bumped me back into the aeroplane, which is fine until its instruments fail and it crashes into the wilderness, and it's like, what? And I found myself seesawing backwards and forwards because of that, because I still liked this idea. I wanted to really get into this, absorbed in this idea of being, becoming at one with nature, and letting the whole of life move away from you. But it just felt too contrived. He kept trying to tell me that that's what the lesson was.
Rather than let you sit with the thing that he is presenting to you.
Yes.
So kind of, pulling back on the slightly more prescriptive stuff.
Yes. I felt it was too. I felt it was that was just overwritten, in the sense that he was hammering his message home. And I was like, actually, you had me at the, we drive at 70 miles an hour, but our mind and spirit don't catch up with it. And I think you had me there, and then you keep telling me it in different ways.
So kind of, okay, now I get that. Maybe I should reread that aeroplane bit. I think I might have just switched off from the aeroplane bit. But kind of on that subject, it's like, since the pandemic, we now work from home. And so, I know we don't have the road travel and we don't have the motorway travel, which is what he's talking about. And the fact that you couldn't, I think he says at some point that you could be driving through Kentucky but not see Kentucky because you're just seeing the motorway, which I thought was also really effective. But that mental kind of thing of being in work and then not having any transition at all that we're now in, which if I was to write a response to this piece, which it did in some ways, it kind of made me want to think about a response, like how would I respond to it in the current age? Because there are universals, in terms of nature, which hasn't changed a great deal, although we probably have more more of the, obviously we get interrupted more by our phones and everything, and we're more contactable. It's harder to get away from the sound of the roads, etc. But that kind of merging with nature, there's nothing new in that. But somehow our need for it has not changed. I mean, it really hasn't. And I think that was what I felt. And maybe it's also partly to do with when you read something, isn't it? But I think I read this and I just hooked onto that because that's all I wanted to hear. I just wanted to hear that because I just wanted to get away. So it's interesting to sort of think about how subjective the reading is as well. Yeah, Julie.
But if he wrote that 50 years later, he would be saying exactly the same thing, and he would be adding to it, and you could call it overtelling, but he would be laboring points about the fact that you can look up at the stars in America's big skies, where you would expect that wilderness is in these areas is kind of wilderness, and you'll still see things that aren't stars but are satellites because of the
Mm,
absolute inundation of satellites in out in the outer space that you can see, and flights coming even more so. And I think that the fact that he's saying this even then, I mean, if he is still alive, he would, I mean, things weren't, and he says that things were only going to get worse. And he is talking about like velocity and speed, and that's with the aircraft as well, and sound. I think speed and sound are the two things that he's most focusing on here. Um, so, I mean, I think for 50 years ago, he was making a quite a strong case that, and he wasn't the first. Obviously, there's the woman who wrote Silent Spring in 1964. So it was the whole growing environmental movement. Plus, obviously, you had the Vietnam War, which he refers to napalm as well. So that whole political and cultural context. Um, and I think maybe I have thought a lot about this myself about American nature writing, which has a much longer tradition than our own from the point of view of writing about wilderness and what it means and things like that. Um, the American, that I think he's doing a good job no matter, and I think I've, if you even read Annie Dillard, for example, using One Creek to absolutely go mad on spirituality and all these, crazy things she does in Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. So these are all this tradition. I think he is writing in that tradition. I haven't read it yet. Still need to read, Thoreau, was it Walden Pond? Those and I think what he's doing is trying to sort of use that as a base, that kind of Thoreau type thing, but then with more of the political of the concerns in the 60s with environmentalism.
mm,
So, and that's probably why maybe he seems a bit stuffy, is because he is writing in that tradition. I think that was the only thing that he knew, because there weren't many around at the time writing about environmentalism and stuff. So,
mm.
I mean, it's something I that much about, but I know enough to kind of think that that's what he was doing. As Annie Dillard did, and hers was 1974, Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. She was not writing on an environmental level, more on a spiritual level. But these are kind of groundbreaking, working in a more modern context on very traditional American nature writing, that went back 100 years.
I think there is a spiritual element to it as well, though, because it taps into that kind of thing of what is what is our nature and what is our identity. Because he talks about the house and all the familiar things, doesn't he? In the house and the familiarity being more natural in your everyday, or that you feel more comfortable in that environment, and then you take yourself out and you're in nature and it feels less comfortable. But actually, when you let yourself give into it, that's more of your natural identity. So it's a sort of unlayering, it's an unpeeling. So I did read it as spiritual as well. I don't know if other people did, but Harriet, you've got your hand up.
Not a little bit. I think one could interpret it as spiritual. But what I wanted to say was a follow-up to what just been said about the period of time environmental. And I'm wondering, the difference is, it seems to me, and I don't know much about all of these writing. I mean, at the time, I read Rachel Carson and all that kind of stuff. But it seems to me that he's trying to go one step further. So it isn't just about we're destroying the planet, which is kind of what a lot of those writers were talking about, or about, the planet as a spiritual entity in itself and the whole Gaia thing and all that stuff. He's also quite fascinated by that juxtaposition of technology as well. And I think some of the thing that didn't quite work for me was he's still struggling with how he gets the juxtaposition. It was 50 years ago, it gets the juxtaposition of the wilderness and the technology and so on. So, for example, I was quite jolted about him describing sitting on the rock and looking out. And he talks about the history and how Indians, Native Americans will have sat there and all this. But then he talks about hearing the hum of the highway from where he is as well. And then you think, oh, that doesn't sound quite so wildernessy. But I think it's because he wants to get that discussion about and the technology in, and hence the whole thing about the flying and the planes. But I don't feel reading this, and who am I to say, really, that he's actually quite worked out in his own head at this point how he wants to present that. So he's definitely is going to. He talks about humanity going towards catastrophe and all that kind of stuff, but he doesn't really. But I don't think he's quite sure where his stance is, really. So somebody keeps ringing my phone. I better go and see.
Thanks, Harriet. Lindy, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, something that Harriet just said. I don't know what he. I would like him, a one sentence thing about what is this about exactly, because it seems to. You've got the personal of himself in the landscape as a detail. You've got the whole thing about speed, which could merge with that. That's fine. Although the airplane, I do find that airplane very odd, because it's not even as though he sees an airplane that I can see. I mean, he doesn't seem to see one anyway. I think he just brings that in from left field. And then he's lots of description of the walk, and that he's cold in the shadow and then he's warm on the rock. Lots of stuff about the history and the Indians and the people in the landscape, the phantoms and all of this. But it kind of, I don't know exactly what the nub of it is. And yeah, it kind of wanders a bit, and it doesn't wander. It wanders in the path. It describes that thing and then goes back down the stream and all of that, which is interesting. But it also wanders from speed to not, and then it wanders from being melancholy to not being melancholy. But that's the other thing. He doesn't let us discover that change in mood. He says, "I know that I will be happy," or "I know it won't last," and this sort of thing. Well, I'd rather he didn't tell me that. I'd rather just see that happen. Yeah, that's where I'm coming from. I would like to know what his intention was. I feel that it was to try and make a point about the environment, which is fair enough, but it takes the personal out of it. And for a poet, I have to say, his prose is not that poetical, to be honest. There's things I like the little fish, and I like, but a lot of the trees, it's like shadow and dark, and yeah, I could see it, although I had to imagine that I knew what the trees and the plants actually looked like, but I could kind of see it, but I didn't feel it. Well, only occasionally did I feel it, is what I'm
It's
saying.
really it's really interesting, isn't it, this? Because I think it really makes you realize how much you need to realize the thing that you're writing, like really feel, I mean, you're saying you didn't feel it, it's probably because he wasn't really feeling it to the degree that perhaps he needs to, or he wasn't capable of, and maybe that can also be it, that that wasn't his sort of, I don't know. But yeah, I mean, it makes me reflect on my own writing that I've perhaps rushed or kind of thought that I'm following an idea rather than actually kind of really living in it. And I think when you're writing personal narrative, this feels more important than ever. It's not like fiction in that way. It's got to be so believable on such a deep level. And that's hard. It's very hard to do.
It
Thank
is,
you.
and I think Julie in the comments, I mean, as he's hit it. Probably, she says, there is an element of performance in this genre,
Yeah.
and I do feel it is performative.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. Absolutely. Geraldine.
Just a bit of context following on from that. It's quite interesting because I was sitting here thinking, speaking as one who can remember the 70s quite well, I thought there was quite a lot of environmental activism at the time, and I just consulted Google as one does on these occasions. And in 1970, environmental activism surged with the first Earth Day, a nationwide protest against environmental degradation with 20 million participants across the US
Wow.
following on a massive oil spill. And it sparked a whole wave of environmental legislation and galvanized a whole movement. And Wendell Berry wrote this in 1971.
Yeah.
So quite interesting. People have used words like performative and contrived and not not saying what and you talked about making something land emotionally rather than in your haste to say what you want to say or say what you feel needs to be said, that you don't actually land it emotionally. And I thought that was quite interesting. But I think this may have been written partly in a response to that whole wave of stuff the previous year.
And,
And
and, and
he just doesn't quite manage to get.
And of course, we don't know the context. I don't know whether in the book it does give a bit of context, but I don't know if it says in Philip Lepate's book, I don't know if it says that it was written by commission or, for a newspaper or,
Mm,
which is going to be
mm.
very different from someone writing it as part of a memoir or writing
Yeah.
it because they feel a real urge to write it and then they put it out into the world. So it may be that there's something in that as well.
I think that's really acute, Lily. Now you've said it, that it smacks of something that was written to not to order exactly, but
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, probably in a magazine, in a kind of environmental magazine or a newspaper, yeah.
yes.
And it probably does tap into that kind of new journalism sort of style as well. I don't know, can't remember when that all started. Can anyone tell me when? Yeah, Julie.
Around that episode, I think it
It
was
was the
late.
same time.
They're called gonzo journalism, where you were in it, but you weren't really in the piece, but you were kind
Mm.
of in the piece. You were offering your opinion, and you were, the conduit or whatever. I was going to mention the point about audience because, again, I was thinking about camping in the American tradition, summer camp, things like that, and so, and it is interesting because he's obviously got his reader in mind, someone very much, outdoorsy, which a lot of Americans are. I mean, certainly back then, I don't know what the camping craze is still. Obviously, summer camps are a big thing there. Um, that people would be familiar with that idea. And I think he was then putting his take on it. He'd left work early, he was then going through this kind of in a very short space of time, um, it sounded maybe a bit kind of contrived and the epiphanal, where he anticipated how he was going to feel because he'd done this many times before, and I think he did say that, this wasn't the first time. But then translating that for a reader, and I do think when you read American nature writing, and you read British nature writing, there is quite a big gap it's very different kind of writing and the scale of it, the kinds of landscapes they're writing about. I mean, I don't know if we really have what we would call wilderness, in the UK. So I am sort of thinking about that context and how and maybe an editor would say, well, you're going to have to, who is this for a general read? It is quite niche. I mean, I write, I've been focusing on place writing, and people say, including on MA courses, I don't normally read this kind of thing. I mean, to your face, and you're like, okay. And then if you try and combine something else with it, they're like, in my case, it's looking at relational trauma and addiction. So you can imagine, that it's niche. It's double niche in a way. So it's quite difficult to combine things. But I think he does. I think he tries, and you can see, and I think it's a great learning thing to actually go through this. I couldn't print it out, but to see what where he's shifting. He doesn't shift gear, but he shifts. He shifts theme. He comes back around. I think he tries to make it as obvious as he can. I think I would imagine if he was writing that kind of thing now, it'd be more nuanced. He was, someone said laboring the point because he's kind of trying to do this thing that is only just starting to be done, and he's grappling, and maybe we could see him grappling a bit. Stretching is another thing, that you can't stretch too far. Stretching the kind of metaphor or trying to pull something in doesn't quite go. Do you know what I mean? So people have been talking about so for me, it's really interesting to hear your comments, because these are all things that I've thought about myself, stretching too far, grasping, trying to include things, that don't quite resonate. It's really hard to do. And I would like to challenge all of you to have a go and introduce something that you feel passionate about.
And also it might be quite interesting.
Like today's.
Oh, sorry, Julie. I missed that.
I was going to do as an exercise of combining some aspect. It could be anything, a walk around the park, with something that's very personal to you, whether it's environmental or not, something about your life, something that you're wanting to write about, and try and combine it with play. Let's not call it nature writing. Let's call it place writing, even if it's a townscape, and just combining those two elements. It's quite tricky.
It's quite difficult. I mean, it would be interesting maybe to follow up next month with a piece, with a different kind of nature piece, actually, and just sort of compare and see, because I'm quite new to all of this kind of writing. But just to see, well, I mean, if we can all agree that maybe another piece is more fluid or more real or more emotive or more kind of genuine, and then look at why that might be as well. I mean, if you can recommend anything, Julie, maybe that's something we.
I know that Cal Flynn. I'm mentioning her because she is a trained journalist, and very much like him. It's not personal. She's a Scottish writer, and she wrote a book of essays in different locations called Islands of Abandonment.
I've got that actually.
Yeah, so but there is a theme. These are all places where the human impact has been devastating, and then when nature kind of regenerates. And one of those is Chernobyl. So maybe, for example, we could read the chapter on Chernobyl and see how she does as a woman in place, like to see how she embodies the place and how her descriptors and what she has to say. She's obviously talking about a theme that isn't like a global theme, but it's a well-known location. Might be interesting to read that chapter.
I mean, if people are up for that, I'm very happy to. I've got the book, so I'll just scan it.
That'd be interesting, because what interests me too is this difference between nature writing as in writing about nature, but using that, there's sort of various things you can do. You can simply write about nature, rather like, if you're writing about the countryside in a descriptive way. But you can use nature, as you were saying, or anything really, as a jumping off point for personal reflection about your life and your thing. And then you've got using it as a jumping off point for a broader political, the small p, more universal point, which isn't essentially about you personally, it's about humanity, if you like, or the world, or what we're doing to it. And what really interests me is how that last one is achieved in a way, because the one in the middle, I think it must be relatively easier in one level if you're doing nature and using how you associate things and your train of thought, because you're writing about your own stream of consciousness also, almost. Whereas with the last one, you've somehow got to weave in where you are and what you're saying to the broader points that you almost know you already want to make. And that it's that skill that interests me. So if that's what this person is doing when that's really interesting. And I think the thing that with this is, with Berry in this particular essay, he's trying to do all of those things at the same time. And maybe that's where it becomes tricky, because you're not just doing nature and you, or nature and the world. You're doing nature, you and the world, and you and the world, and the world. And so for the reader, you're constantly jumping around trying to make all of these connections. Now, I'm not saying it couldn't be done, but I think maybe that's where it gets tricky, because it's not yet. It's really hard, I would imagine. It's not something I've ever tried to do, but I can see maybe that's what part of the issue is for this particular essay, maybe. But really interesting.
Yeah, twice as long. That would have helped, actually.
Yeah, I was going to say that it's very short. Yeah, so he's maybe
There's there's a chapter in Islands of Abandonment where she goes to the Scottish island where people used to live there, and they're abandoned sort of homes, but there's still this breed of cow that's there. So again, it's not really nature writing. I would say it's more place writing, and it's not memoir. It's definitely non-fiction. So you don't get to know very much about her, but I think she does include a little bit about herself to do with where she used to live. So for a memoirist like myself who likes place writing, nonfiction, and memoir and nature, all getting someone who writes about all of those things. There aren't many people that do all of those things. I mean, obviously, Noreen Masood did, didn't she, in
I was
a
going
flat
to
place where
mention
you're
that.
making a political.
Yeah, I was going to mention that.
It's called
Mm.
nature writing, personal narrative memoir. Yes, she does do that.
Yeah,
So.
she. Sorry, I was just going to say, Julie, that I was going to mention it, and then I thought, well, is it really nature writing? Because she doesn't. I mean, she is writing about place, but it's so much through her perspective and her relationships. And that's what I really enjoyed about that book, was that she puts herself and her mother, for instance, in a place. And of course, she's talking about the flat landscape and the effect it has on her. But it's really about the dynamic between her and her mother. I found it, I mean, I found it such a lovely, I love that book so much. So
I
yeah.
think, yeah, the dimension that she lacks, if you are a true, whatever that is, place writer, stroke nature writer, is there's an ethical sort of accountability of where you're writing about that isn't to do with filter.
Yeah.
Hers was so good that it becomes almost slightly kind of so projected that you wonder about the poor place that she's writing about and everything else about
But
it.
ultimately,
Like
it's the place, not one big metaphor for her.
Yes, it is. The flat
Whereas,
places, yeah.
whereas if you're really, I don't, as I say, I don't know anything about this really. I've not really gone into, but it seems to me exactly as you're saying, if you're really writing about nature, then you have to be writing about it for its own sake, in addition to whatever it is, not using it as a huge glorified metaphor for whatever
because it
personal theme you're trying to write about.
I'm to explore some of that. I'm thinking about doing this PhD, which I'm applying for at the moment, and looking about the ethics of place writing. People talk about the ethics of memoir writing, but what if you're writing about a place? What duty of care do you have to that place? I don't think you can fully project onto it without representing that place and some of its own challenges beyond what you see in it, what you know to be true because you've researched it.
Yeah.
This is something that
you have some obligation to represent it in a way that isn't entirely through your own eyes somehow. That it's somehow about talking in it, if you see what I mean, in itself, rather than how you receive it.
Well, there's the whole
point on that is the places that we're writing about these days are because of the climate change, etc., is about vulnerable places. So you can write about vulnerable people, including yourself, but what about vulnerable places, of which so many are in terms of ecosystems and the challenges of all the things that Wendell Berry was kind of talking about. So what is the duty of care in terms of an ethics of place writing? That's what I came up with as my theoretical.
I think it's absolutely fascinating and so relevant and so important because, I mean, within the context of our thinking and the way we abuse nature. And so, yeah, totally 100%. And, to read a piece about Chernobyl, which is going to be even more so, the respect that we need to have for that place than anyone who writes about it. So I think that would be a really good choice, Julie. So thanks for suggesting that. I'll
do that next, and then we can,
I'll scan that and distribute it. The next session I need to look at my diary because I'm away, and I guess some of you might be away, so I've just got to fit it around when I'm available. But I hope that you can all join. And also there was another recommendation from you, Lindy, I think, which was the Nan Shepherd, and I haven't read Nan Shepherd, so I'd love to read that as well. So is that an essay or a chapter, Lindy?
It's a book, but it's got chapters in it. It was an unknown classic. She put it away in a drawer, and only in 1970-ish did it come out again. She sent it, and it got published, and it's been there ever since. And it's her life in the Cairngorm. She used to go walking nearly all the time. It was her place. So
brilliant.
yeah, it's an amazing bit of writing.
Yeah, wonderful. I've heard it recommended before. Thank you so much, and thanks so much for everyone for coming. And have a good holiday season if you're already breaking away. And see you.
Thanks, Lily. Thanks, everyone.
Okay.
Bye.
See you.
Bye.
Bye.